China started establishing a collaborative training facility on the Caribbean island of Cuba, sparking worries that this move could potentially result in the deployment of Chinese forces in the waters near the United States. As reported by the Wall Street Journal, talks between China and Cuba have progressed significantly, although they have not yet been finalized. According to the article, China and Cuba had confidentially arranged to establish an electronic surveillance center on the island, situated approximately 200 kilometers from the southern United States. The facility's purpose would be to intercept electronic communications from the southeastern U.S., home to numerous military installations, as well as to monitor maritime traffic. The report further mentioned that an agreement in principle had been reached, with Beijing committing to provide Cuba with several $1 billion for the establishment of the facility. According to the report, officials from the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden have been actively attempting to dissuade their Cuban counterparts from formalizing the agreement. The report was published a day after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken concluded a two-day trip to Beijing, during which he held discussions with President Xi Jinping. This marked the most senior-level visit to China by a U.S. official, occurring amid increased tensions between the two major global powers. During the meeting, both parties acknowledged incremental advancement in reducing tensions and expressed a commitment to continued diplomatic engagements. They also pledged additional high-level visits from the U.S. in the upcoming months. Secretary of State Blinken informed reporters that he had clearly conveyed during his visit that the United States would hold significant reservations about any Chinese intelligence or military activities taking place in Cuba. Meanwhile, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby conveyed to reporters, "It's not a concealed or unexpected fact that China is endeavoring to enhance its influence and reach. We are well aware of this situation. It's not as though we have not been observant of it. We will persist in taking measures to safeguard our own confidential information and national security." On the other side, the Cuban government strongly criticized this recent development. Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos Fernandez de Cosio categorically rejected the Wall Street Journal article as completely false and baseless, characterizing it as a fabrication by the U.S. designed to rationalize the enduring economic embargo against Cuba that has been in place for decades. The most recent report emerged just days after the Biden administration confirmed that China has been conducting surveillance operations in Cuba for an extended period, with upgrades made in 2019. As shared by a current and a former U.S. official with the Wall Street Journal, the potential new military facility, as reported, is believed to be part of China's Project 141. This initiative seeks to enhance China's military and logistical support network on a global scale. U.S. officials have also reiterated their desire to reinstate military-to-military communication between the United States and China, an aim that Secretary of State Blinken was not able to achieve during his visit. Officials have consistently cautioned that the absence of military communication could potentially result in unintended escalation, citing instances like a recent near-miss between U.S. and Chinese aircraft in the South China Sea, as well as a close encounter involving U.S. and Chinese naval vessels in the Taiwan Strait. China has been running an intelligence unit within Cuba for a number of years, with upgrades made in 2019. This action is in line with Beijing's broader endeavor to enhance its intelligence collection capabilities on a global scale. Biden administration officials have indicated that although the former U.S. President Donald Trump's administration was cognizant of China's attempts to establish a presence in Cuba and made some endeavors to address the issue, sufficient progress was not being achieved, necessitating a more direct approach. These officials mentioned that U.S. diplomats had been in dialogue with governments that were contemplating hosting Chinese bases and had exchanged pertinent information with them. Similarly, Russia revealed the potential for military deployment to both Cuba and Venezuela last year, should negotiations with Western nations regarding Ukraine not yield favorable outcomes. Simultaneously, Russia cautioned that ongoing discussions with NATO were reaching an impasse. Responding to these threats from Russian officials, the Biden administration pledged a resolute reaction if any credible evidence of these threats emerges. In an apparent effort to escalate matters with the Biden administration, Sergei Ryabkov, who headed Russia's delegation in discussions with the US, stated on Russian television that he could not definitively affirm or rule out the military deployment to Cuba and Venezuela in case negotiations fail. During an interview on Russian TV, he emphasized that the course of action hinges on the actions of our US counterparts. He referred to Russian President Putin's caution that Moscow might implement military technical measures if the US provokes the Kremlin and intensifies military pressure.
Could you address the Deputy Foreign Minister's comments, Sergei Ryabkov, suggesting that that Russia could deploy forces or would rule out deploying forces in Latin America?
If Russia were to move in that direction, we would deal with it decisively.
Ryabkov drew a parallel between the present tensions concerning Ukraine and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union stationed missiles in Cuba, prompting the US to establish a naval blockade around the island. The crisis concluded when then US President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev reached an agreement wherein Moscow would withdraw its missiles, and in return, Washington pledged not to invade Cuba and removed US missiles from Turkey. Cuban exiles have been closely monitoring the ongoing confrontation between the Biden administration, Russia, and China. They are hopeful that this shifting geopolitical landscape might encourage the Biden administration to encompass Cuba within the sphere of US influence and take more proactive measures to pursue regime change on the island. Ryabkov's remarks could potentially fuel the conjecture that the Caribbean nation might once again become embroiled in a situation reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Amid escalating tensions between Havana and Washington during the Trump administration, Russia deepened its ties with the communist island. Moscow extended loans and heightened military collaboration. According to a senior official from the Russian Ministry of Defense cited by the US-Cuba Trade and Economic Council, establishing a substantial presence in Cuba could generate significant investments in upgrading infrastructure such as airports and ports. The Russian official estimated that having around 2,500 Russian civilian and military personnel stationed in Cuba might contribute around $100 million annually to the Cuban government. Additionally, Russia could potentially provide Cuban authorities with an additional fee, similar to the arrangement for hosting the Lyudz intelligence listening post near Havana in the past.